Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd invite, again, everyone near the door to pass through it and find a chair. And for those of you who are still outside, to encourage people to set their coffees down and come through. This is our concluding session of the IISS 15th Manama Dialogue. And as we do each year, we try to innovate in different ways. So let me explain a little bit the idea we have for this morning's session that will end on or about 1 o'clock, giving you all time to secure a decent lunch before potentially packing and having a safe trip home. What we plan to do is first, I will hand over the chair of this session to our Deputy Director General, Dr. Koizaki, and she will chair a conversation for about 28 minutes or so with the other 4 people on this stage, and she will do it in the style of a podcast. And in fact, once those 28 minutes have been live recorded, we will issue this as a IISS podcast from the Manama Dialogue. So that's the first 30 minutes or so, and she'll introduce each of the 4 participants as she engages them in conversation in the vigorous and probing way that is her style. When that part of the session has completed, I'll take over the chair for the only reason that I still have access to the technology here, and invite questions, comments, your own conclusions from the floor, and then at the very end, any one of the people sitting on this panel who have a reaction to what you say will bring that in. But to reassure you, the first 28 minutes will be recorded as a podcast. When I start chairing the Q&A, you won't be recorded, though you are going to be, in some measure, in the public domain with what you say and how you contribute. And of course, at the very end, it'll be my great pleasure to thank the Kingdom of Bahrain for hosting this event, working so effectively with us, and the IISS staff for their noble efforts in putting this together. But I will wait to thank people until we're at the very end, and to get us happily and intellectually treated to that end, Koizaki.
So we are going to start our conversation with the impressions and assessment by our 4 panelists of what they've heard over the course of the last day and a half. And I'm going to start with the guy who has the best job title in the IISS, John Rain, the Senior Counselor for Geopolitical Due Diligence. John, what'd you hear and what do you think about it?
Thanks, Corey. I just about know what my title is now, thank you, but I guess many in the room will forget that. I hope you don't forget me and what I say. The great thing about speaking at the end of the day is that, this day in particular, is you can get to recycle all the brilliant things that have been said by other people. So I'm just going to have a stab at bundling up some of my impressions based upon the insights and contributions of all of you. And I have a very strong sense this year that we're looking at Middle East, which is changing its geopolitical shape in many ways. And we haven't yet seen permanent alterations to the political geography, to borders within the Middle East, but we've seen really substantive differences to the way in which Middle Eastern countries aspire to be, conduct themselves, and interact with foreign powers. And as ever, if there's a process of reshaping going on, that can either be done internally or it can be a result of external forces. And so to take the first one of those, I think the level of ambition that we've felt in the Gulf, both to develop Gulf countries and economies, and also to take a more forward role in the region and beyond the region, both in development and in conflict resolution and a developing influence, is quite a striking feature. And looking back 10 years beyond that, that's not something that we have always associated with this part of the world. That's an exciting new development. And as for the external pressures on the region, the discussions that we've had often have been about how countries in the region relate to external influences, both malign and benign. So on the one hand, we've had a lot of discussion about how this region in particular, the Gulf, deals with the pervasive influence of Iran. And obviously that's very much on our mind as an institute, given the work that we've been doing on that. But similarly, we have talked about, in less detail, the influence which Russia wishes to exert here, and China, through commercial and trade channels. We've also found ourselves quite often talking about the European role, and it's striking how frequently we have in some way looped back to NATO and the NATO countries, and the role of European countries extraordinarily well represented this year as ever. So for me, the way that those relationships develop tells us just how internationalized the region is. And when we were talking about the solutions that are available, I was particularly struck by this tension between the desire for workable, local, enduring solutions and the depth of internationalization, particularly of the Gulf. One has only to look at the waterways, the issues around maritime security, freedom of the seaways, just to see how global an area this is already. So I was left with the feeling that whatever the solutions are to the proliferation of crises in the Middle East, they absolutely have to have an international dimension. There are multiple complex stakeholders here to be managed. And my final reflection on the discussions that we've had is that there's a real willingness to confront the very large number and variety of what we call asymmetric or irregular threats in the region, which have undermined the stability of the state-based structure. And in many ways, these threats are within societies, within jurisdictions in the Middle East. And if I'm allowed to end with an aspiration, it's that we, certainly as an institute, can help deepen the understanding of those threats and refine the responses so that we preserve those vital principles to which so many people spoke of territorial integrity and sovereignty.
I too was really struck by the extent to which over the course of the last couple of days we heard anxiety about a potential diminished American involvement, at the same time a desire for greater regional solutions. I think navigating those two things will be a big part of the challenge going forward. Next up, Hassan Al-Hassan, fellow at the IISS Middle East office. Tell us what you thought you heard.
Thank you, Corey. I think we heard a lot of interesting points from the Chinese delegation. I do want to expand on the geoeconomic aspect of Gulf-Asian relations. I do like the title of the session, The New Geoeconomics of the Middle East, because I think it touches on the transition from the old transactional buyer-seller relationship between the Gulf states and the Asian countries and the Asian economies, where price competition was the name of the game, and the exchange was all about the Gulf states exporting energy in the form of oil and gas in return for finished consumer goods. And I think we're clearly transitioning away from that model into perhaps what one may call an integrated model, where we are jointly investing further down each other's supply chains. And I think the underlying principle today, the order of the day, is securing stable market access, be it on the supply side or on the demand side. So I think what this implies is that for the Gulf states, I think this explains the thrust of the Gulf states' investments especially into downstream oil and gas in Asia. We've seen a number of pledges. Saudi Arabia and Aramco, of course, and ADNOC of the UAE are both investing in large-scale refineries in the Indian western state of Maharashtra. Saudi Arabia is acquiring a $15 billion stake in Reliance Oil, their downstream petrochemical and refining business. And I think Saudi Arabia is building Pakistan's largest oil refinery in Gwadar. And so we see a sizable presence of the Gulf states in downstream oil and gas in many of the Asian economies. Conversely, rather than simply exporting finished consumer items, the Asian countries are also increasingly interested in deepening their investments into the technological infrastructure of the Gulf states. And I think Huawei's announcement of partnering with Bahrain and Saudi Arabia to build the 5G network, I think is an important milestone in that regard. There are challenges. I don't think it's going to be an easy ride through and through. I think the two major challenges, the first one on the investment side, which I think applies equally for the Gulf states and the Asian states, is managing regulatory and political risk. And I think Gulf telecom operators, including Bahrain's Batilco, Etisalat in the UAE, who have tried to penetrate the Indian market, know a thing or two about that, unfortunately. But I think the same thing applies to Asian investors trying to navigate the regulatory waters. I think this is one of the reasons why the bulk of the investment is going to be state-led rather than private sector-driven. And I think it will require solid political will on both sides to make these investments work. I think the second major challenge, especially from the Gulf states' perspective, is translating those trade and investment gains into security gains. And I think that's been extremely difficult and quite obviously so in the aftermath of the Iranian attacks on the Saudi oil facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais. Of course, the Asian countries condemned it, but did not want to really point the finger at Iran. So I think that's a perception that the Gulf states will be trying to change.
I think it's very interesting that you think there's a natural progression from economic links to security links. I think that's worth exploring a lot more, both the expectation and whether there's data that underlies the expectation. Next up, Emil Hakim, who runs our Middle East program. What have you heard? What are you thinking about based on the conversations of the last couple of days?
Well, a year ago, the theme of the Manama dialogue was about the reordering of the Middle East. And then when Sir Tom Beckett and myself thought about, and John Chipman thought about what the theme of this year should be, it was conflict and competition. You know, we went back to the themes that really dominate the regional agenda, unfortunately. I think first and foremost, what's striking is that the local, regional, and international drivers of conflict and competition are still very potent, despite everything. The fatigue factor hasn't really necessarily hit where it should be in the manner that it should be, so that every actor really recalibrates. In the past year, we saw an increase in fighting in Libya, in Syria, even as people were hoping that somehow things would stabilize. I think also it's not a time for complacency as well. If you look at where domestic and political unrest has hit in the past year, Algeria, Sudan, Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, Egypt in September, I saw quite large demonstrations. Put together, this is around 300 million people. So, you know, the risk of being complacent about the potential for destabilization, the potential for governments not to listen to their population, to use massive force, but is there. At the same time, we had some intriguing developments. Sudan, for instance, has a transition that is better than what many people expected. At one point, there was an expectation that Sudan could be somehow the new Syria. Now it has a transition process. Perhaps and we have to make sure that that transition process succeeds, because we don't want another Yemen where you had a transition process that then fails, and then you have a massive civil war. A couple of other points that really caught my attention. The first one is that battlefield dynamics still dictate outcomes much more than political processes, even if endorsed by the UN, and if there is a sense of international commitment to that process. This is the case in Syria, This is the case in Libya, where actually the UN process has been derailed by the ambition of a local actor. In Yemen, what we saw is that a combination of factors, primarily pressure on Saudi Arabia and others, has actually helped advance a political process there that may not deliver the goods, but it's still better. So Hodeidah, the agreement, the Riyadh agreement that we saw a month ago, is also quite significant. But force still matters. And we need to invest a bit more in the diplomats and in those doing stabilization, because as we see in Syria, an actor can come and disrupt very easily a massive investment to stabilize a specific region. The other point that I wanted to make is that international tensions can exacerbate problems in stabilizing countries. So one example, for instance, is how the US-Iran competition plays out in Iraq, for instance, or in Lebanon. In a way, it's understandable. These two actors have their interest, they're invested in those arenas. At the same time, given how fraught the politics are in both places, given how difficult it is for the population to have their basic needs met, for public services to be delivered, and so on, this layer of geopolitical competition makes it a lot harder. And there's no clear answer right now about how to manage that. I mean, it still feels that this is an issue on which no one wants a full-fledged conflict, but actions here and there may lead to it and inflame different arenas. Again, Iraq, possibly Syria, possibly Lebanon. So I think, unfortunately, as I said in my session, we will still have a conflict and stabilization panel at next year's Manama Dialogue and the year after.
Striking to me, again, the underlying assumption that the widespread use of military force in the region wasn't going to be the dictator of outcomes, right? The aspiration that diplomatic efforts would overtake that, which feels like a natural transition to ask for the comments of the head of the Defense and Military Analysis team at the IISS, Bastian Giegerich.
Corey, thank you very much. I wanted to add to our podcast conversation here a dimension that speaks to the global context in which our conversation here takes place. And I want to say a few words about how European politics affect the conversation here, and adding to Emil's point about international tensions as a factor. I think international distractions can also be an issue, and the menu is rich, ranging from our conversation about the future of NATO, which played here at the margins of the Manama Dialogue, the conversation about the strategic autonomy of Europe, and of course Brexit is a factor as well. I just want to maybe say a word about that NATO conversation, because I think we heard different visions and ideas from several important NATO countries here at the dialogue, and I think there are three dimensions that I think spell trouble in terms of the lack of coherence. And the first one is what I would call an emerging values gap among some of the allies that perhaps played out in the conversation between Turkey and Germany that we heard yesterday around the basis and the legitimacy of certain actions amongst allies. The second one has more to do with how NATO allies can invigorate the commitment enshrined in NATO's Article 5 around collective defense, the collective defense guarantee that has now been put in question by the presidents of 2 out of 3 NATO nuclear powers. That seems to me a bit of an issue. And the third one is how to deliver the capability, readiness, and spending commitments that would ensure better burden sharing, but also better capability and capacity to help stabilize and play a constructive role in conflicts beyond NATO's territory. And it seems to me that one of the problems that emerges from that is that when outside actors, outside powers look at the region, that people in the region have to, unfortunately, deal with a situation where the outside political will is located is not necessarily where the outside political or military, whatever you want to call it, resources are located. So you have to manage that increasing divergence, perhaps. And those who want to do things are not necessarily the ones who have the means to do them. And I think the other impact and implication is just the multiplicity of voices that I think we have heard, and the different pulling in slightly different directions when it comes to stabilization and what stabilization means in practice, and the order of and the preference order of the different instruments for stabilization. And I think that makes it harder to come to solutions and advance a collaborative approach. So you know, my last line is going to be just to say, John Shipman mentioned at the beginning of this 15th IISS Manama dialogue that you know, we're seeing countries building their strategic personality, and we see that in development. And it seems to me that based on some of what we heard from the European players involved, Europe needs to be careful that it doesn't build its personality disorder in this regard. And I think that is something that worries me a little bit.
So I noticed two similarities, two themes that I heard a lot of in the last couple of days that I also heard at the IISS Shangri-La dialogue last spring. The first was the anxiety about ebbing American interest and engagement, which I didn't anticipate hearing in quite the same way in both of these two environments, given that the United States national security strategy is emphasizing the Pacific so much more. I was surprised I heard it equally in both places. The second thing I was really surprised by, and Hassan, you picked up on it as well, the idea that countries in the region are going to be forced into trade-offs between what they view as their prosperity agenda and their security agenda. And that's not something I at least had heard previously in this regional conversation, and I thought I heard a lot of it this time. John, do you have any reflections on that?
I think the security imperatives are so strong that inevitably that's going to be the default position. The interesting point that Hassan made was the diversification of economies in the Gulf is a really exciting departure, to use polite language. In other languages, it's very risky. And it may be that in the opening up of economies, and as Hassan illustrated extremely well there, in the forging of different international relationships to underpin those economic plans, there are new security dilemmas and new security challenges. So for me, it's all bundled up with the changing shape and identity of the region and shifts in the very comfortable geometry in the Gulf, which we've been used to. Some of those will be benign, some of them will be a bit risky.
The other thing I was surprised by was the effort on the part of American participants to reassure countries in the region of our continuing interest by using military metrics. Servicemen deployed, number of exercises, and how little traction that seemed to get. Was Bastien, Emile, do you have a different reaction to that?
No, I think that's a very good observation, and I think again it is one that actually applies to this region, but goes beyond. And we've seen parallel conversations in other parts of the world where there seems to be a disconnect between the perception in the region of what is going on and the metrics that are being presented. And I think that reassurance that we heard is important. But I wonder whether it really hit home, whether it really resonated. And because it seems to me the voices we heard from the region were concerned about the political and diplomatic commitment, and not so much about an extra deployment here and there, unless it forms part of a recognizable strategic narrative for the region, which I don't think they felt they heard.
Emile?
Certainly. I mean, the perception of U.S. retrenchment in the region is pervasive. The way I put it is that President Obama made the professorial, intellectual case for it. It sounded good, but it played out pretty badly. And President Trump is making the God-driven argument for retrenchment and a change in how the U.S. operates in the region. I mean, certainly after the attacks in Saudi Arabia, the way President Trump spoke about, tweeted about that, made it was transactional. Is that it wasn't an assertion of U.S. interest and U.S. interest in the global public good. It's like, we'll do something if our friends in Riyadh want us to do something, but then we have to talk about what the payment would look like. I mean, and shifting what was a U.S. investment in Gulf security as a global public good to a more transactional affair, which shakes also the fundamentals of the region. Perhaps the region needs less U.S., but it would need to be done in a pretty ordered way. And it would need to happen within a regional security framework. That's not the discussion we're having right now, and this is what's unnerving a lot of regional actors.
Excellent. So several years ago, Dr. Chipman wrote a terrific article in Harvard Business Review about how businesses need to develop foreign policies. And I want to close this panel by going down the line of John, Hassan, Emil, and Bastian to ask you if you could give one piece of advice to governments, businesses, or the expert community about the region and its security and prosperity, what would it be? You can choose what you think experts, journalists, and academics. You can choose businesses. You can choose governments. What's your one closing piece of advice? John Rain.
Mine would be that the area is still an area that represents enormous potential, both in terms of return on investment and human capital. But you won't survive without a foreign policy, and you can't have a foreign policy unless you do your geopolitical due diligence.
Very good. Hassan.
I would say watch the security economic nexus very closely. The Asian economies, especially South Asian economies, are highly energy-intensive, price-sensitive economies. And to grow, they rely on the continued flow of energy from the Gulf at stable prices. That's very difficult to do if Iran decides to take out a sizable chunk of Saudi Arabia's oil production or blow up oil tankers in the middle of the Gulf. So I would say watch that security economic nexus very closely, because I think a large portion of global economic growth depends on it.
Excellent. Emil.
Mine is not going to be a geopolitical point. I will make a human point. Cynicism is not a good compass to operate in the region. I realize that the Middle East is exhausting. Its conflicts, its divides, and there's a sense in a number of places that it's hopeless, that those wars cannot be settled, that you have to live with large numbers of refugees, and that conflicts can be just managed and frozen. I think it's a cynical attitude towards all that is not going to help. It's not going to fix anything, and we still have to deal with the consequences of a lot of chaos and disorder for a number of time. So as difficult as it is, a more voluntarist approach to the region is needed, not an approach of pure containment, managing the problem from afar, hoping that it doesn't spill onto other regions of the world.
Excellent. Bastian.
I'm going to go slightly outside of my area of responsibility because I was one of the things that impressed me most this year at the Manama Dialogue were the voices from the next generation, the younger generation, who I think raised some really important questions and brought a fresh perspective on a lot of problems. So my advice would simply be to invest in their capacity to make not just their voice heard, but also enable them to help drive the future of their respective countries.
Excellent. And mine would be drawn from what the Jordanian foreign minister said on one of the panels yesterday, which is that we should both have trust and have confidence that regional solutions, to invest in regional solutions, to invest in regional answers to problems, to invest in regional institutions, rather than trying to impose an external or universal set of principles on the region. We ought to really trust in the region's ability to solve problems, and we need to invest in the region's ability to solve problems. And with that, Dr. Chipman, I hand it back to you.
Well, Corey, thank you very much. I think you have a future career as a news anchor, because I advertised that you would do a podcast in 29 minutes and 30 seconds, and I was watching the clock carefully, and you drew your remarks to an elegant conclusion before the 30th minute was arrived at. So international media, that's another skill set that you've obviously shown to us today. What I want to do now is open it up to everybody to give their own concluding reflections and ideas to the IISS also about the kind of research and data that we should be producing that is helpful to the region and its connections with other parts of the world, topics that we missed, issues that we should maybe even address at the 16th Manama Dialogue. And I invite you all to engage in the two-step process by which you will be familiar, which is to put your badge in and press your microphone. The first few people who appeared on my list were all three British generals, so I have to be very careful about my adherence to the proper principles of diversity. So I'm not actually going to pick any of the three British generals who came first up on my list, because since I've said there were three British generals on the list, I've now seen four other people seek the floor. So I will try to make certain that there's a wide representation of you. But don't worry, British generals, you will end up coming in. But let me begin with our host country, Omar Al-Ubaidi from Bahrain.
Thank you. My question is to the panel about Sudan. And when many countries in the region have tried to enact domestic reforms, external actors have interfered and changed the direction. Sudan, things seem to be quiet. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the influence of external actors on the future of Sudan in the next 5 years? Thank you.
Adnan Hassan from the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to compliment the IISS. It's my first attendance at it. I do attend events around the world, and this was excellent. Well done. The youth and the young generation. This is the first generation in the world that has grown up in a global context completely connected. We've never had a situation where people are growing up with information all the time from everywhere. There are 7 billion people on the planet. There are 14.1 billion cell phones. And the cell phone that we have has more processing capacity than what we had in the Apollo space program. I think that this changes the Middle East, and the Middle East, in fact, is an incredible user of technology and information. And so it's already in a global context at the individual level. And that's going to affect a lot of what people see, hear, and think. And new applications are not just coming out of Silicon Valley. The success of TikTok is actually quite remarkable because it actually originated in China. So with that context, I just want to make a comment about what happened with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of the absence of hard power. It failed to inspire. And as the US recalibrates, I don't think it retrenches, it recalibrates. The question I have is, who steps in to inspire?
Simon Mail.
Thanks very much, John. I just want to take up Hassan's point and Corey's response about increasing economic links with China leading to greater security engagement. And it's worth remembering the first sort of Belt Road Initiative, or the latest was the British Empire in many ways. And people always talk about flag follows trade, which we know is rubbish. In fact, trade follows the flag, rather. Flag follows trade. And if the flag doesn't follow trade, people have local solutions to it. And the East India Company actually grew its own army to defend its interests. And it just strikes me that China is going to need Middle East energy far longer than the West or America, and that's part of the equation that's withdrawing America from the region or retrenching. And they will inevitably be drawn into trying to defend those interests, to my mind. They don't have faith in the international world order. They've contributed to that lack of faith themselves. And it's no doubt about the buying up of ports, the maritime routes which they're establishing, and the growing blue water naval power is designed to replicate, to an extent, what the Royal Navy did on behalf of British imperial trade in the 19th century. So I think it's inevitable that China is going to be drawn into this region much more militarily for all the reasons that go with establishing economic interests.
And Simon, will they do that with private military companies?
It's part of a hybrid. I think a lot of us are finding ways in which you guard, you only got to look at their, I suppose, some of their, what do you call it, raw material assets in Africa. They sit there, extractive industries guarded by private military means. But I think when you see the flow of oil, as we all know, going east, 17 million barrels a day or whatever it is, 30 million through the Malacca Straits, it's China that's going to need to defend those trade routes to continue to have access to Middle Eastern energy. And I think, as I say, if you look back to an analogy with the British Empire, one way or another, they will need to defend those economic interests because they will not have faith in local military or security resources.
Great. From the United Arab Emirates, Omar Al-Alam.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I have two questions, if I may. The first is, there wasn't a lot of light shed on the European role in the Middle East compared to China or Asia specifically, and the US. I do believe that historically Europe played a big role in shaping the borders of the Middle East and actually putting some of the processes and some of the systems here. So would Europe still play a big role in the future, or is it going to focus on its internal issues? The second is, as a bloc, I think the Middle East ranks among the lowest globally in terms of internal trading amongst countries within the Middle East. I think less than 16% of trade in the Middle East comes from Middle Eastern countries amongst themselves. Is there any idea or initiative that you think should be put in place to allow for trade to happen within the Middle Eastern countries, for the economy to actually thrive and for countries to be able to create an economic platform like the EU or like what exists in Asia as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Emil Hokaim talked about the human dimension of security, and so I'm delighted to call on Fabrizio Carboni from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Its head, Peter Moore, is a very good friend of ours, and I'm so glad that you're here.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to attend this meeting, because as humanitarian, I can tell you it was quite an enlightening 2 or 3 days. We have our perspective of conflict, which is a very down-to-earth perspective. And the question I have for you is that during these 2-3 days, I haven't really heard the fact that the humanitarian crisis affecting the region will transform the region. We have millions of people displaced. We have millions of people wounded, treated in substandard conditions. We have hundreds of thousands of people who disappeared. We have tens of thousands of people detained in substandard condition. And I would like to know, how do you integrate this dimension into a political and security reading of the region?
Thank you very much. Tom Beckett.
I suppose the question I'd like to ask is why is it so difficult to create effective alliances in the Middle East? If you look at what we've got here, the GCC essentially stemmed from the Iran-Iraq war, and was one of its intentions was that it would provide some sort of collective defense, which it never has. More recently, the Islamic Military CT Coalition, which is Saudi-led, doesn't seem to have done anything. The French-led European Maritime Surveillance Mission is taking ages to get going. And then more recently, the American idea of a Middle East strategic alliance, which seems wholly transactional and goes back to Emil's point about what is the American approach now. And if it is transactional based on more recent US activity, if nothing else, the sort of parsimonious response to the attacks at Abqaiq and Khurais, what should the region expect from a Middle East security alliance if they join it. And I contrast that with the gap that was filled when the Royal Navy left and the US Navy had to come in because there was no presence. When the US Navy came in here, it has led what was in those terms national interest, but then almost became an altruistic presence to allow global free trade through this region. So what is the sweet spot for creating alliances in this region when none of the others seem to be working?
Tom, thank you very much. I've got 6 or 7 people on the list, but there's quite a menu already, so I'll come back to a few of the people on the panel, then go back out to you, and then we'll conclude. Hassan Al-Hassan, what was your reaction to what you heard? Answers too.
Yes, sir. I did want to specifically speak to General Mayo's point, and I think he spoke very elegantly about the inevitability of Chinese military involvement, sort of the flag following the side by side with the trade, so to speak, because of the need to secure energy interests. Allow me to add a layer of complexity by bringing India in, because India's energy resources are even less diversified than the Chinese. They rely more heavily on the Gulf. It's one of the least diversified Asian economies, as a matter of fact, in terms of energy supplies. It has very little strategic reserves, so it's very vulnerable to what happens in the Gulf. And of course, it has a geographic, cultural, and demographic advantage in the Gulf when it comes to China. There are millions of Indians, South Asians, living in the Gulf. And the question is, when that time comes, when the issue at the moment is that there's an Asian perception that the maritime and regional security of the Gulf is an exclusively American problem, which I think is a perception that is not widely shared in the Trump administration. The question is, when that inevitability materializes, how does it take place and under what conditions? Well, yeah, you do this, perhaps. Bringing in the Chinese, the Indians, maybe even the Pakistanis, all of whom have competing interests when it comes to the security and the maritime regional security in the Gulf.
Emil Hukaim?
Many points. I mean, first, on the long-term effect of the conflicts and their humanitarian consequences. It's going to be with us for a long time. I mean, just from purely personal perspective, at one point I was a refugee, and my wife is a refugee. We're the lucky ones. But keep in mind that this is an experience shared by millions and millions across the region at this point. This is why when Corey asked us to provide one piece of advice, fight cynicism, because I think there is a way to adjust and normalize this horrendous situation as long as we keep it contained far away until you can't, until the political, financial, security costs of doing this become too high once key funders look elsewhere and so on. The refugee and IDP crisis in Syria has fundamentally changed the nature of the country. This is not the same Syria as it was in 2011. 6 million people abroad, so 25% of the population lives outside the country. 25% of the population lives inside the country, but not where they lived. Only 50% continue to live where they were living in 2011. This is massive, and it's possibly one of the biggest tragedy that has affected, if you look per capita, the world. But up until now, we see no real drive to address this issue. I think that whether it's the Geneva process or the Astana process or great power engagement and so on, none of them will provide the kind of solution that is needed to settle those large numbers. And so what we'll do is every year or two, we'll hope that there'll be generous funders, large countries that will come up, will have statements of principles, but not really address the political and security drivers that lead to all these people leaving. So I'm a bit skeptical on this front. On the issue that my boss, Tom Beckett, raised, why is it so difficult to create alliances in the Middle East? Well, we wrote countless papers on this issue. And I think it's a mix of factors. One, there is a huge imbalance between local capabilities and expectations and what the rest of the world is willing to put into that. If the GCC had become a real security alliance, took for almost 40 years from now, then the international actors would have looked at the GCC and the potential for regional organization to provide for regional security more seriously. This hasn't happened. We see alliances, not necessarily formal alliances. The Saudi-UAE rapprochement and today alliance is perhaps the most significant development in Gulf politics in this decade. There was an intervention in Yemen by both of them, but the goals weren't aligned necessarily. The resources weren't there. They didn't have the same level of experience, right? So this alliance has also engendered frustration because, both sides look to each other as a problem solver, but it doesn't necessarily come through. Regionally, an alliance against extremism doesn't mean anything because, it's a concept that, extremism is something that you have to define in pretty, specific ways if you want to enroll people, other countries to join in. And often we actually don't define what the real threat is. Now, there is an agreement, for instance, on Iran. But the difference here is that the risk appetite of the various countries that sit on the other side of the Iranian issue varies massively, which is why it's difficult to create an alliance on the specific issue.
I'd like Kori Schake to answer Tom Beckett's question as well, but also to answer her own question that she posed to others, which is essentially, how does the United States develop a strategic narrative that is more carefully blended with its military posture to make a more successfully compelling case for its engagement in the region?
Let me take the easy one first, which is Tom's, which is an incredibly hard question. I think there are three reasons. What I notice as an alliance expert in a different regional context is that there are three important factors that I think you see in all deeply engaged alliances that we have not seen either among the countries in the region here or among those countries from outside the region seeking to play a role. And the first is trust, right? I thought the French Defense Minister Parly's talk on the first day was terrific, and I was surprised at the number of people who were unpersuaded by her argument that France would be a major security guarantor if something difficult should happen in Syria. So I think the trust issue, and I heard it all over the place about the United States presentations as well, right? That they are trying to say, we're trustworthy, and the best answer they could come up with is, we are militarily engaged. And that's actually non-responsive to what people are genuinely worried about, which is the political unreliability of the United States, especially right now. And so I think trust is the first thing. And the second thing is the way in other alliance contexts, trust gets established or deepened. If you think, for example, about the way Germany after 1945 comes to be such a trusted partner for the United States and for other Europeans, institutionalization is a big part of that, right? The corridors at NATO meetings, the routine engagement that gives transparency, that gives predictability. I think relationships both among countries in the region and relations by outside actors are under-institutionalized in a way that makes the trusting relationships more difficult to grow. And the third thing is the values issue, right? That it's very hard to persuade my mother that American national interests require stuff. It's hard to get her to act on that basis. She's quite sentimental, though, about the truth she holds to be self-evident. And so the narrative that will make American involvement a lot more stable in the region is the crafting of a common narrative based on values we and our friends in the region share, and having an honest conversation about where is the overlap and where are the disparities will be essential, I think, for sustaining long-term, predictable American engagement in the region, especially as the national security strategy begins to get traction and you see the diverting of American attention increasingly to the Pacific.
Marvelous. I'm not forgetting Bastian Giegrick or John Rain, but I want to go back to a number of you, and then Bastian Giegrick and John Rain will get first dibs when we come back to the panel. But Dhafar Al-Umran from Bahrain.
Thank you, Chairman Dr. Chipman. Thank you, John Beckett, for inviting me today. It was my pleasure to be with you. We had a session before, and I mentioned, I talked for a while, but I know we don't have enough time, so I will focus on just two things. First of all, I think unless the world decides to look at things, we need a policy, not a reactive policy, but a proactive policy. If we still patched whatever problems we have, Iran will enjoy the game. They are enjoying the game because we are waiting for Iran to hit, and then we shout at Iran, and then she hits again, and we shout, and this is an unending story. It's time to be a little bit firmer and tell Iran enough is enough, because the area cannot prosper with Iran dealing with us in this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And also from Bahrain, Fatima Al-Saraifi.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. During the last few days, it was highlighted that Iran is in a vulnerable position economically due to the sanctions being imposed on it. However, its non-state alliances still has allowed it to have an effect with minimum cost. I would like to hear the panel's thoughts about what we can do to counter this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Florence Parly's name was mentioned, so perhaps we can have another French perspective from Françoise Bourg.
Thank you very much. There is an extraordinary similarity in the debates one hears these days on the impact of American transactionalism. What Emile said a few minutes ago, what we hear in South Korea, what we hear in Europe. And my question is, how much of this is Trump dependent? Concerning this region, is there anybody on the panel who would paraphrase Joe Biden's statement at one of the Munich security conferences recently, where he said, once Trump, my words, not his, once Trump is gone, it's going to be back to the good old days. Will it be back to the good or the bad old days, or won't it be? Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll let Kori Schake think a little bit more about that before I give her first responsibility to try her hand at that. Jonathan Shaw.
Yes, thank you very much. An observation and then a question. My observation is that the best dialogues in this excellent couple of days have been when adversaries have been on the stage together and you've been able to contrast ideas directly. Where that hasn't been the case, the debate tends to be a bit one-sided and therefore less constructive if we're searching for the sorts of compromises that we need. So my entreaty is that you keep trying to get as wide representation as possible. I know I tried to represent the Russian position somewhat inadequately, but I think that sort of effort, some method of representing adversarial views, even if we can't get the Iranians or the Israelis or the Russians to attend, I think would benefit the whole dialogue. My question refers to what Kori mentioned about the link between economics and security, and it goes back straight to what Hassan al-Hassan had said about states in this region choosing 5G, because the United States has been very open about the security implications of people choosing 5G, and if indeed this region does switch towards a Chinese 5G network, then what implications would that have for the United States' engagement in the region? Would it encourage the disengagement of the United States? And of course, that question relates also to Europe. So John Rain and Mr. Galgrich might like to attempt to answer that one as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And from India, Krishna Nair.
Listening to the panelists talk about geopolitical change in the Middle East in the global context, my mind goes back to the time when I lived in this region 41 years ago. In those years, the only Soviet embassy in the region was in Kuwait. The Chinese were nowhere in the picture. In fact, they were still picking up the pieces left behind by the Gang of Four. I heard some discussion at this year's Manama Dialogue on Russia. There was a lot of discussion on China. But the question I want to ask is about Central and Eastern Europe. When I was living here, the Central and East European countries started coming in. The Romanians, of all people, exported Dacia cars to the region. The what was then Czechoslovakia started relations with Sharjah, commercial and tourism-related things. But in the years that followed, now, I'm aware that there is a delegation from Czech Republic here, but broadly I find that Central and East European countries have completely retreated from the region. I mean, not just in our dialogue, but generally they have retreated from the region, and I wonder if anyone in the panel would like to address that. But if I may take 1 minute as an aside, Adnan Hassan spoke about the collapse of the Soviet Union. When I was living here, the Soviets exported the first Lada cars to the region. And the cars arrived in summer, and they came without air conditioning, but they had very good heating fitted in it, So if the Soviet Union exported Lada cars to the region in summer with heating and no air conditioning, it was not a surprise that the Soviet Union collapsed. Thank you.
I think that is an anecdote that will now enter the general strategic narrative on the complex history between the Soviet Union and this region. A couple more interventions and then we'll come back. First, Azam Zakane.
Shukran.
Thank you. I will speak in Arabic. So that the Manama dialogue is general and comprehensive, fair, just, we have to talk about all the problems present in the Middle East. We cannot give superiority to one conflict over another, and this is something else, in my opinion. Second, with regards to Safadi and what he said, ma'am, he also talked about the Palestinian cause and the need to solve that in a just and fair way, according to the international solution that has been agreed upon, a two-state solution coexisting in peace. And unfortunately, until now, we have not mentioned that. And the Turkish delegate and the Chinese delegate as well, and Amr Moussa spoke yesterday, and you all heard very carefully what he said about the Palestinian cause as one of the main and chronic problems and conflicts in the Middle East. But I have not seen in this dialogue that the Palestinian cause is even put forth as a problem that is prevalent in the Middle East. Thank you.
Puma Bakay from Pakistan.
Thank you so much. My view is from somebody who's from outside the region. And my takeaway is fairly simple. My takeaway is that the security construct is extremely Iran-centric, a bit like South Asia, where Pakistan has been very India-centric, with apparently no solution on the table and the problem becoming more complex. And that's how I see the situation here. Everybody is talking about it. Iran is the elephant in the room, but nobody seems to have a way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So I think what I'll do is I'll ask Baskin Gugich first to pick up anything left from the previous round and this one, then John Rain, then Emil, then Hassan al-Hassan, and we'll have Koi give the last word on United States and anything else that occurs to her. So who did I say was going first? Sebastian, thank you.
Thanks, John. Let me pick up three points that were made. First one made by by Minister Al-Alama about the role of Europe, and I think, I mean, we heard from France perhaps the clearest statement in terms of willingness to fill any perceived gap left by others through disengagement, primarily from the US. I think, though, the point to note is perhaps that European engagement will probably only matter if it is coordinated, because I would argue that even the bigger European countries are too small on their own to make a strategic, significant impact. And that is the point that worries me, because I think we Europeans don't have that cohesion and coherence right now. So while I think there is a willingness in some quarters to take on that greater role that you alluded to, perhaps, I think we're not well positioned to deliver on that right now. So I think that would be my note of caution. And I think something similar perhaps goes towards that nexus between the economics and security, whether that is vis-a-vis China or others. I think Europe has been late to waking up to that reality. I think I personally take some or draw some confidence from the way that the incoming president of the European Commission and previous Manama dialogue attendee, Ursula von der Leyen, has positioned herself and her incoming team as decidedly geopolitical in nature, and that would indeed be a shift for that body. We will have to wait and see how that plays out. But I think it reflects a greater awareness of those set of problems which Europe before, or European institutions at least before, ironically perhaps treated in different silos and did not make the connections, even though they have the potential to do so. And just finally, a quick point on Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, I don't know about the economic links and how they have developed. As you mentioned, there is a delegation here. But I think in terms of my area, defense and military matters, I think it's fair to say that part of Europe simply has a different concern right now, and looks at a different geography for when it thinks about the core security challenges that it wants to deal with, and that is, of course, further to the east. Thank you.
John Rain.
Why are we all talking about Iran? It's a fair enough challenge. There are other security challenges which the region has risen to, counterterrorism, to name but one. But I think it's right that the architecture and the conversation is shaped around Iran. And two reasons for that. One is that the Iranians fight inside our guard, to use a boxing metaphor. This is not an adversary with which anyone in the region is formally at war, and it's not an adversary which is seeking to annex territory or to engage in an open military conflict. It's determinedly avoiding that. It poses a deep and abiding challenge to how we configure national and coalitional response. So I think it is important that the lessons that Iran has taught us are ingested and translated into national security strategies. Because Iran isn't going to stop doing it, and it's a technique which is transferable to other states who may want to fight inside our guard. Somebody raised the question, a Bahraini colleague, about the money supply issue to Iran and whether it makes a difference. I'd cite that as another example why we need to be concerned about what Iran has built and what Iran is doing, is it does not depend upon a high level of resourcing. We have found in the region that other threats, which do not depend upon a high-level resourcing, are abiding and difficult to deal with, in particularly terrorism and militias. Now, a point I'd make in support of that, just slightly to one side, is that of all the phenomenon that we will have to deal with, perhaps the most troubling socially is the high level of militification and militarization. And if we were to look at the proliferation of small arms and small arm usage across the region, that looks like a generational challenge, reversing the dependency upon force as a means of settling and arbitrating disputes. And the final thing, if I may, John, I'd like to pick up is an excellent question from Adnan, which I can't get out of my head. Who steps in to inspire the next generation? It's a great question. It will be a determinant of regional security. UAE Foreign Minister Anwar Gangash made a couple of particularly interesting statements about the importance of the moderate Arab core. In an age when inspiration can be lethal, and we've seen that. Daesh, as you rightly said, Adnan, amplified instantly through social media. What matters is less the inspirational ideology, it's the ability to contain the bad inspiration. Just holding the moderate ground, the sensible conduct of a secure state is going to be so important. And I did wonder whether, if we were to look at those who've been inspired to demonstrate in the streets of Beirut and Basra, it is less about causes, it is more about just governance, competence, and the removal of privilege and corruption. So all that argues very strongly in my mind for good governance, moderate, inclusive, determined state building, rather than instantly inspirational message. Great question.
Thank you. Emil Hokayan.
Thank you. First, I realized that we skipped the question on Sudan, and to some extent because there's no Sudan expert here, but we have an excellent one in our London office. His name is Andrew Chi, and I encourage you, Omar, to check his work. He knows and has written extensively about this issue. So I will pass on the question, but I will refer to his work. You know, I want to go back just to the issue of Iran. It seems, I agree that at times it feels like we talk too much about Iran. At the same time, I want to reinforce what John said. Around the region, the country that has committed resources, decades of investment, etc., in cultivating non-state partners, in inserting itself in the politics of a number of other countries, is primarily Iran. Now, it's, as we found in the dossier, it's done so in pretty effective ways in some places, and it hasn't worked as well as in others. But it would be delinquent on our part not to realize that, for instance, in the most recent past, the country that has actually taken military action against other countries from here in the region, direct one, I'm talking about the Gulf region, is Iran on major facilities that have critical global import. And that's not going to change. You know, the national security establishments in the region will continue thinking about that. From our perspective, the idea is to assess the nature of the threat, of the challenge, and provide some ideas. Some of our colleagues have done excellent work on the missiles issue, where they debunk some of the assumptions that are made in the region about what Iran is doing. Our own work is about the networks of partners, looking at where do they pose a real challenge and where are they a secondary issue. But that's not going to change. The region, the promise of Iran is real. A Gulf region in which Iran is integrated at the political, security, and economic level it's a prospering Gulf. Iran has talent, it has great history, it has a lot to offer. But Iran, as it is today, is not a stabilizing actor, and one can feel that in a number of arenas around the region. Let me just one quick question, comment on U.S. policy, and I'm sure Corey will have the more detailed one. Is it Trump dependent? I would say most of my interlocutors in the region trace the retrenchment from the previous presidency. There is an understanding that there are structural factors driving all that. The change, and I'm curious what Corey says, is how the U.S. talks about the region, especially this extreme transactional nature of the relation, the mindset on what were pretty strong traditional relationships.
Thank you, John. I'd like to go back to the question of Ms. Fatma Sayrafi and the whole topic of Iran. And I'd like to bring an Asian perspective on this. I think the Asian perspective on this is very critical because the Asian economies, China, India, and so on, are not only they're of course the major economic partners of Iran. They're the primary buyers of Iranian oil, including during times of sanction. They continue to do so, usually under the table and so on. So it's very important to take stock of their perception of this. Now, what I'm going to say next is not a particularly popular opinion in Gulf policy circles. But I think that the Trump administration's withdrawal from the JCPOA has done great damage to as far as our ability to create a global consensus on managing Iran's nefarious activities, be they nuclear or otherwise. I think the withdrawal from the JCPOA has painted Iran as a victim. And I think that narrative has gone a very long way. And it's become very difficult to argue against it. We've seen this even in the remarks of the Chinese, that they are now viewing, in a sense, the escalation in the Gulf as through the exclusive prism of the JCPOA, and that this is a JCPOA symptom, withdrawal symptom, and this is something that needs to be managed by whoever breaks it fixes it. So obviously it's an American problem. So I think that's a major challenge that we need to address. And as I say, the Asians are very important in our ability to manage and deal with Iran. The second point that I would like to refer to, a question raised by Mr. Scholl on the implications of Huawei 5G in the Gulf on U.S. engagement. Now, of course, the Gulf states are not the only U.S. partners that are rolling out 5G. And we saw the big security leak in the UK about the UK's potential plans to roll out 5G networks as well. I am highly skeptical that the US will be able to roll back the tide of technological progress. I think it's completely unreasonable for the US to expect its partners and allies to forego the economic and technological benefits of 5G technology in exchange for something that's not entirely clear, especially at a moment of US, I don't want to say retreat, or decline, but let's at least say retrenchment. So I think there are structural factors here that are bigger than and more powerful than the political will of any one player or the other. That's what I'll say. Thank you.
Great. Koishaki.
So to Francois' question about whether there's a snapback after the Trump administration, I think there are two variables in this. The first is whether other countries permit the United States back into a privileged position that we have had. And the second is whether we choose it for ourselves. To the first variable of the equation, the great genius of American power after 1945 is that we constructed or attempted to construct an international order that wasn't just beneficial to us, it was also beneficial to many others. And that meant you had voluntary compliance. And the point about America's power inspirationally is partly tied to building an international order that others also benefit from. And the rules and institutions that govern that order, although we don't always comply by the rules we set or participate through the institutions we believe in, have made the order predictable and beneficial for those who opt into it. And that's reduced the need for the United States to enforce it. I think what we are seeing now is that, 3 years into a Trump administration, the United States, and I take Emil's very good point that there are elements of continuity in the Trump administration's policy, and one of those with previous administrations, and one of those elements of continuity is a post-Iraq war weariness with the problems we and others cause in the region. But I think you see other countries moving on. I mean, Japan, Canada, Mexico, Australia, South Korea brought the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership into being, even without American participation. I think there is a lot that the middle powers who care about the preservation of the order, France prominently among them, are doing to try and stabilize an order that the United States has destabilized. And that's even before you get to the challenger countries like China and Russia, who want a different kind of order and will be forced to comply. If a return to the order would force their compliance to it. And that's not going to be an easy diplomatic, economic, or security needle to thread. The second variable in the equation is, what do Americans actually want? And I'll give you one taxpayer's opinion, but in a boisterous country of 335 million, it's one taxpayer's opinion. My sense is that what President Trump has done brilliantly is ask first-order questions. Why does the United States care so much about the security of countries that don't seem to care about it nearly so much for their own well-being? Or why are we expected to solve problems that other people won't make compromises to solve? It looks to me there's widespread American support for the president's perspective on those questions. And people like me have not done a good enough job answering my mom's and President Trump's fundamental questions. But what I think you also see, and this gets borne out in polls of American public attitudes by Pew and by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, is that people are also deeply uncomfortable with the president's policy solutions to that, because they can see the costs accruing to us of what we're trying to achieve in the world. And that goes back to this point about inspiration in particular, that the United States looking so transactional, making our alliance relationships look like we're shaking down our closest friends in the world for more money, and corroding the institutional stabilizers of the international order. Those things aren't particularly popular, and the costs of them are going up. So the great genius of the American political system is we overcorrect in lots of directions. And so I think you begin to see a counterweight to the president's positions. And we'll know in about 11 months' time whether that there is going to be a snap back to more traditional post-war American policies by the United States as a result of the election. I do think if President Trump is reelected, there will be the affirmation by Americans of the president's policies will irrevocably prevent a snapback to a prior more predictable and more stable order.
Kori Schake, thank you very much for so charismatically chairing the podcast and so vibrantly answering the questions that were posed to you, and to all of my colleagues here for answering your questions. Let me draw this 15th Manama Dialogue to a close with one or two reflections about the dialogue and a couple of very necessary thanks to different groups of people. First, a historic reminder, we started the IISS Manama Dialogue, which John Rood correctly said in the first year was called the Gulf Dialogue, in 2004. And when we did so at a time when no foreign minister, defense minister, national security advisor of the Gulf states were regularly used to making statements in public and answering for 45 minutes questions from a wide international audience in ways that would enter the public domain. So what our mission was initially was to bring greater strategic transparency to the debate of issues of peace and security in this region. And I can say that in the early years, the statements that we heard from ministers from this region, and to a degree also from the visiting regions, were fairly formulaic and quite communique in style. And as the dialogue has embedded itself in the strategic culture of the region, we have had much more frank statements, much more direct interventions, greater agreement on some issues, and a greater spirit of intellectual competition on others. And I think in recent years, we have heard even more, to use a word I've just used a second time, vibrant statements from this region, because as I said in the opening dinner, this is a region that is going through what I would call a period of strategic self-determination. They went through a period of political self-determination in order to gain nationhood and formal sovereignty. Strategic self-determination means developing a strategic personality, a strategic culture that then needs to have public expression. And even in societies that are not fully democratic, a degree of local and public support and legitimacy. It has always been our goal, in the celebrated, cliched, but nevertheless important phrase, to make this an inclusive dialogue and to have participants from all parts of the Middle East and from countries who disagree with each other. And we've sometimes been successful. A few years ago, we did have then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton speaking, with then Iranian Foreign Minister Mottaki speaking, and I can assure you that it was a very vigorous 24 hours we went through. A day or two later, Minister of Foreign Affairs Mottaki traveled to Senegal and got a call in Dakar from Tehran, sacking him as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran, because the degree of controversy that he publicly had with Hillary Clinton was not to the complete satisfaction of some of the security authorities in the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the participation of the Iranian Foreign Minister in the Manama dialogue was not, in that case, a career-enhancing move. That is not to say that we will keep on trying and ensure that even when diplomatic relations are difficult, and especially when diplomatic relations are difficult, that we get the primary actors of the region and beyond involved. And when I say beyond, I say from those geographies that are developing a greater stake in the region and in which countries from the region are becoming more politically and economically invested. And that's why you have seen a growth in the participation from Asia and from Africa. And that is something that we will continue to see. And we were really delighted, for example, with the participation from China, Japan, but also from Somalia at this event. And I promise you at the 16th Manama Dialogue, we will have a richer and wider display of participants from Asia and Africa, as well as the traditional participant countries of North America, Europe, and of course the Middle East. But the fulcrum of the Manama Dialogue will remain the Gulf. There are many international conferences that cover the wider Middle East, and we will want to have North African, Gulf, and Levant participation. But I think it is important to have the voices of this region expressed in this region with the international participation that we have the luxury to be able to attract to this country, since it is such a great host for us all. And that brings me to my first general vote of thanks, which is, of course, to the Kingdom of Bahrain for their support and hospitality, to the royal courts of His Majesty the King, the Crown Prince, for their assistance, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Bahrain Defense Forces, the Ministry of Interior, the police, for the protection and logistic assistance they've given to us, and of course to the people of Bahrain, who have been such tolerant and gracious hosts of this international gathering, which has been very large. We've had 509 delegates, but 3,179 officials and entourage in support of them. We have had 35 government delegations, but 53 different nationalities represented. Several hundred bilaterals have taken place that we have been able to record, and I know a number of which we are not formally aware. So this has been an intergovernmental process as much as one engaging experts with ministers. And we're particularly proud that the inaugural Young Leaders program, I think, was successful. We had a majority of women participants in that Young Leaders program, which is a reminder that the inclusiveness of this region is something that is important. The young voices that we have heard, including to my immediate right, have been amongst the more intellectually stimulating and best grounded both in data and analytical power. And to the women and men who joined us at the Young Leaders program, could I re-advertise what I did when I spoke at the Young Leaders program? Please tell all of your best friends about the IISS and the Manama Dialogue, and we hope to double or triple the participation of young leaders at the 16th Manama Dialogue. Of course, I want very much to thank Sir Tom Beckett, the IISS Middle East Director, and his phenomenal staff here in the IISS Middle East office. We've also had great support from the IISS staff in London, Washington, and Singapore. And I hope that you will join all of me in thanking the Kingdom of Bahrain, thanking the IISS staff, and congratulating yourselves on the fantastic contribution you've made to the success of the 15th Manama Dialogue. We'll send you the dates for the 16th soon. Have safe travels home. Thank you for your participation.